Good evening. I am Dr. Bob Uzzle, instructor in government at Cedar Valley College. Hope everybody is having a good day. This is my first of 14 lectures that I am recording for my online class in federal government for the spring of 2020. This first lecture is entitled "The Citizen and Government." Government refers to the institutions and procedures through which a land and its people are ruled. Government can include everything from simple town meetings to complex, vast establishments found in large countries. Governments vary in structure, their size, and the way they operate. People will argue all day about what government should and should not do, about the purpose of government, how government is supposed to be financed. Taxes are by definition compulsory payments to government. There's absolutely no way you can have a government without taxation. And the great American humorist Will Rogers once said that Americans are more concerned about having fair taxes than low taxes. I think the vast majority of Americans would agree with that statement. But exactly what determines fair and unfair taxation is where you're going to find a lot of differences. If a candidate is running for office and he talks about raising taxes or lowering taxes, I contend that he's told you absolutely nothing. And if you have a chance to talk with that candidate, you need to ask them what taxes they're talking about. What taxes will be raised, what taxes will be lowered, who will pay those taxes, who will be affected by the tax increase or decrease. So taxes finance government, and governments take various forms. In America, we pride ourselves in having a democracy. We have a representative democracy. Direct democracy is something that's very rare in our world. Main places you'll find it today is in New England town villages, where they have this town hall meeting. Every resident has the right to express their opinion on matters such as taxation and land use. They don't have anybody elected. Even in a small town, that would not be practical today. And you elect people to represent you at the city council, on the school board, the county commissioners court, in the state legislature, and in Congress. Representative democracy is the way things work. And governments differ in their power and freedom. Authoritarian governments recognize no formal limits on their authority, but are restrained by the power of other social institutions. And totalitarian governments recognize no formal limits on their power, also seek to absorb or eliminate other social institutions that might challenge them. And most Americans want to avoid anything resembling authoritarian or totalitarian governments. Again, democracy is a system that permits citizens to play a significant part in the governmental process. Citizens are vested with the power to rule themselves through elections. And so that's why you probably, if you listen to any news lately, the vote is something very important. How people are going to vote, whether it's going to be directly at the polling place or in view of the coronavirus. There's more stress now upon voting by mail or whatever. And we're going to, in the next few months, I venture to say, that controversy is not going to get any better. It's going to get worse. It's going to be greater conflict over that. But constitutional governments are the norms in a democracy. Whose formal and effective terms are placed on the limits are placed on the powers of government. Constitutions are the legal structures of a political system. And we'll say more later about the U.S. Constitution, how it was adopted, and the meaning of it today. A key force behind limits on government power are the rise of the bourgeoisie. This comes from the term bourgeoisie comes from bourgeois, the French word for free men of the city, of the middle class, as opposed to the aristocracy. Karl Marx, the author of the Communist Manifesto, wrote about the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the development of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that being the working class. And we embrace limits on government, advance principles of individual liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, freedom from arbitrary search and seizure. Now, freedoms are not absolute, and a lot of times freedom and order come in conflict with each other. The freedom of speech has its limits. It was the Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that freedom of speech does not give you the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. Because if you do that and there's no fire, there's going to be a stampede, possibly injuries, and maybe even some deaths. So there's got to be some limits on that. We have freedom of speech, we have freedom of the press, but that does not give one the right to carry out libel and slander. The difference between these two, libel is something in print, whereas slander is verbal. Political participation gradually spread, making politics increasingly relevant to all. Politics is conflict over leadership, structure, and policies of government. I've also heard it defined as who gets what, when, and how, whatever there is to get. And politics always involves power, the influence over a government's leadership, organization, or policies. Politics is shaped by the system of government in place, especially in democratic governments. Again, we talked a while ago about direct democracy, a system that permits citizens to vote directly on laws and policies. You have ballot initiatives, popular referenda, and as I say, in some very small villages in New England, everybody has a vote on everything. But when you get a larger number of people together, that's not practical. And with representative democracy in a republic, the government in which the people select representatives who play a major role in governmental decision making. And people do have the option, if they don't do their jobs, if people become dissatisfied with the representation they're receiving, you have the right to vote against them. And if you get enough people thinking the way you do, you can vote them out. Throw the bums out, as they say. Sometimes that is done. Sometimes it's hard to do. Some people, it's been noted, they have 9 lives as far as politics goes. But some people can be defeated. The government, again, with selective representatives. Citizenship is based on political knowledge and participation. Enlightened political engagement was an ideal put forth by the ancient Greeks. Citizens need political knowledge. That includes knowing the rules and strategies that govern political institutions. Very interesting reading. It's been a long time since I read it. Is the book The Republic by Plato. And Plato was very influential in a number of different circles and still is. Plato, though, was very critical of democracy. He saw it as rule by the ignorant. At the same time, he was even more critical of tyranny. And he developed the idea of the philosopher ruler, who would be trained from childhood in both philosophy and government in order to be the intellectual and political leaders of the people. The Plato, of course, had studied under Socrates. If Socrates wrote anything, there's no record of it. It has not come down to us. His teaching was largely verbal. Plato was his most famous student, and Plato's most famous student was Aristotle, who in his book, The Politics, has some different viewpoints than his teacher did as far as political theory is concerned. Probably Aristotle's most famous student was not a philosopher, but rather a general, the person of Alexander the Great. And citizens, though, need knowledge to assess their interest and know when to act on them. You studied civics in high school, and that's part of what it was all about, to teach and to understand the idea of citizenship and to idea of voting, know what you're voting for. When I was growing up, you had to be 21 in order to vote. And there was a lot of dissatisfaction about this, because if you were 18 years old and a male, you could be drafted to serve in the military. We no longer have a military draft in this country. And it was in 1971 that the voting age was lowered to 18. There were a lot of protests among young people at the time, and many argued that if young people got the right to vote, that there'd be less dissatisfaction. I voted for the first time in March of 1972, which was 2 months before my 21st birthday, so I did benefit from that, but just barely, lowering the voting age to 18. But I remember in high school that was a very controversial issue, as was the military draft during the time of the Vietnam War that was becoming increasingly unpopular. There's more opportunities exist today for political knowledge and participation through online activities. And for that matter, newspapers have difficulty keeping subscribers. There's people who want the traditional hard copy of a newspaper. But if you need a particular newspaper article, you can go online and get it and print off a copy. So they've had to find other ways to make money. And most of us don't have time to read a newspaper every day. Got so many other things going on. Digital citizenship refers to the ability to participate in society online. In a 2015 survey, a full 65% of the respondents reported using the internet to find data or information about the government. Digital citizens are more likely to be interested in politics, discuss politics with their family, friends, and co-workers. You know, political knowledge varies from person to person. There's some of you, maybe I'm sure, are taking government only because it's required, and its politics may not be a big interest to you, and which is fine. Some people take politics very seriously, get active in politics. They campaign for various candidates and engage in many debates and arguments. But I'll put it like this, you know, I certainly, over the years, I've kept up with politics, I've been interested in it, studied it. But I found that arguments, whether it be about politics or religion or whatever the topic may be, arguments generally are not good for one. physically, psychologically, or spiritually. And so, if you can have a discussion without getting into a heated argument, well and good. But heated arguments are not good at all. And debates, of course, are, if you had speech in high school, if you've taken speech courses in college, debates follow certain rules. It's not just getting up and arguing. You've got, certain things you have to follow. And in the next few months, we'll see a lot of that. It was 1960 was the first time there was ever a presidential debate. It was between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Those who listened to it was not only on TV, but it was also on radio. Those who listened to the debate on the radio felt like Nixon won the debate. Those who watched it on TV gave the debate to Kennedy. And Kennedy won. And a lot of controversy over that election, whether it was stolen or not. There have been a number of elections they claim were stolen, but there was no debate in 1964 between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. And Richard Nixon apparently learned his lesson. He did not debate Hubert Humphrey in 1968, nor did he debate George McGovern in 1972. However, in 1976, there was a debate between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. And ever since then, there's been a presidential debate. 1980, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. Then in 1984, there was a debate between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. And for the first time ever, there was a vice presidential debate between George Herbert Walker Bush and Geraldine Ferraro. And there have been debates ever since. Now they have 3 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. So we're going to see 3 debates between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and 1 debate between Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. And it's questionable what purpose these serve. Normally, someone who is strongly committed to one candidate is not going to be swayed to switch sides because another candidate does better. There might be some convertibles in there. And there are some people who hadn't made their mind up, and that may make a difference. But people get their political information more from the internet than from traditional newspapers and magazines. Political efficacy has been on the decline. Belief in the ability to influence what the government does. In 1960 poll, 1/4, 25%, said elected officials did not care what citizens thought. And nearly 3/4, or 74%, felt that way in 2015. So I've heard it over and over again. Some people who don't vote, do not take part in politics in any way, will say they're going to do whatever they want to do anyway. So why should I even try to make a difference? Loss of efficacy is bad for democracy, as the relationship between efficacy and participation works in both directions. The U.S. population has grown from 3.9 million in 1790 to 327 million in 2018. Much of this growth comes from immigration. And even a person who has casual observance of the news knows immigration is a hot button issue now. The first census did not count Native Americans. The American population is principally of European origin. However, the U.S. has become much more ethnically diverse over time. And the typical American, there is no such thing. And America is supposed to include all of us, not just one select group. And with immigration policy, as the U.S. has grown more diverse, anxiety about Americans' ethnic identity is mounted. Could the nation absorb large numbers of immigrants? Were the immigrants' political and social values compatible with American democracy? Could the immigrants learn to speak English? All these are big questions. When I was working on my master's degree in political science at the University of Texas at Arlington, one of the courses I took was entitled Immigration and Public Policy. We had an entire semester devoted to these issues. Several laws have been passed over the years to limit immigration into the United States. And after World War I, Congress established national origins quota system. It established a hierarchy of admissions. Northern European countries received more generous quotas. Was that racist? It certainly was. And there was a lot of controversy over the Chinese. There was a Chinese Exclusion Act passed when the Intercontinental Railroad was finally dedicated, when they had the joining of the rails at Promontory Point, Utah. They had the railroad officials and many of the workers posed for a picture. But the Chinese, many of whom had worked very hard on that railroad, were not allowed to be part of the picture. There was, during World War II, we were at war with Germany. We were at war with Italy. We were at war with Japan. Many Japanese Americans were placed in camps. They were treated in a way that most Americans today agree was wrong. These were not concentration camps. There wasn't torture or anything like that, but resettlement camps, I forget exactly what they called it, but anyway, they were internment camps. But there were many German Americans and Italian Americans. No such action was taken against them, so there certainly was a double standard there. By 1970, foreign-born population in the U.S. had reached an all-time low of 5%. The use of racial and ethnic criteria to restrict U.S. population is not new. In 1790, the federal government passed a law stipulating the only free whites could be naturalized citizens. It was not until 1870 that Congress lifted the ban on the naturalization of non-whites. A little known fact of history is that in 1924, Congress passed the American Indian Citizenship Act. Only then did Native Americans receive the right to vote. The 1882 was the year of the Chinese Exclusion Act that outlawed the entry of Chinese laborers into the U.S., and these restrictions were not lifted until 1943. That's during the time of World War II. China was our ally at the time, so we eased up on the way Chinese were treated, but made it much harder on Japanese. By 1965, Congress had lifted many of the strict immigration limits. The result of this was new waves of immigration from Asia and Latin America. According to the 2016 U.S. Census, America is 61% white, 5% Asian, 13% African American, 18% Latino, and two or more categories, 3%. It was, I believe, 2000 was the first year that the U.S. Census Bureau had a multiracial category on the census form that one was required to complete. Immigration patterns also diversified the nation by religion. A full 80% of the adult population was Protestant in 1900, compared to only 47% in 2014. Other religions include 21% Catholic, 2% Jewish, 1% Muslim, and 29% reported no church affiliation. There are substantial numbers of Hindus, Buddhists, Confucians, Taoists, Shintoists, others, etc., etc. It was at one time quite common for people to go from cradle to grave without ever meeting a Hindu, a Buddhist, or a Muslim. That's no longer the case. They're everywhere. And so, in a multicultural society, inherently becomes a religiously pluralistic society. Since 9/11, there's been a lot of effort to restrict bringing Muslims in and what they can and cannot do, the building of mosques and many other things based on the claim, which has not, there's no substantiation for this at all, that every Muslim's a terrorist. That's not true. But we live in a world in which many stereotypes still exist. Age distribution, geography, and socioeconomic status can all impact politics. Different age groups have different needs for public services. Increasing numbers of Americans live in urban areas. Issues of concern are often different than between urban and rural areas. One of the big mistakes made by Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election was to totally ignore rural America, as well as the Rust Belt. Most of those areas, many of which had been traditionally Democrat, were carried by Donald Trump. I venture to say Joe Biden will not make that mistake this year, if he has any sense. And when any election takes place, it's studied afterward, look back over it, see what mistakes were made and what can be avoided in the future. But rural areas certainly are important. Not that many people are in agriculture anymore, but nobody can say agriculture is not important. In fact, I've often made the statement, if anybody says they're not interested in agriculture, here's my response. You eat, don't you? If you eat, you have an interest in agriculture. And the farmers remain the backbone of our society. Economic inequality is on the rise, and incomes of people in the middle class have largely stagnated. But there's a few fundamental values that underlie the American system of government: liberty, equality, and democracy. As far as systems of government are concerned, I want to say this. The vast majority of Americans are going to agree that government is necessary. Now, you can Google a term, anarchy. Anarchists believe in no government. There have been anarchists in the past. There are anarchists at present, and I'm sure there'll be anarchists in the future, but their numbers few and far between. The idea of no government is something that doesn't appeal to many people. Again, people can argue all day how much government is necessary, what government should and should not do, how government should be financed, and many other questions, but people do agree that government's necessary. Liberty, equality, and democracy are important values reflected in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Liberty is freedom from government control and economic freedom. Personal freedom is to be guaranteed by the Bill of Rights. Economic freedom, this country stresses capitalism, free markets, protection of private property. When people speak of property rights, they're not speaking of the rights that property has, but the right of people to own property. And liberty is linked to the concepts of laissez-faire capitalism, a free market economic system with minimal or no government interference. Laissez-faire means hands off, although the term free enterprise is more of a slogan than an actual description. The Declaration of Independence declares that all men are created equal. Again, the founding fathers who wrote that had a very limited understanding of it. Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. And so obviously he felt like some people were more equal than others. He owned a lot of slaves at his estate at Monticello, and while he saw himself as a benevolent master, there's studies been done. He was not above using discipline, including beating, well, whippings or whatever for those slaves who were disobedient. And we now have DNA evidence which give pretty good support to the claim that his slave, Sally Hemings, was that Jefferson was the father of some or all of her children. And in recent years, the descendants of Sally Hemings have earned the right to be buried at Monticello. But Thomas Jefferson recognized slavery was a great evil. He admitted that, but he didn't see a way to end it. In fact, he was heavily involved in it. He was often in debt. When the creditors came knocking at his door, he was not above selling slaves in order to have money to pay his bills. So there was a great deal of contradiction. Beautiful words, all men are created equal. But the reality was something different entirely. Principles of equality included equality of opportunity, the ideal that all people should have the freedom to use their talents to reach their fullest potential. Obviously, that didn't apply to slaves. Political equality, the right of all people to participate in politics equally based on the principle of one person, one vote. But at that time, nobody seriously expected African Americans, Native Americans, and women of any race to receive the right to vote. That would come later as we expand our understanding of freedom and equality. Democracy is also an important American value. In a democracy, people choose their leaders and have some say over who their rulers are. When ultimate power rests with the citizenry, it's called popular sovereignty. Power rests on principles of majority rule and minority rights. The government follows the preferences of the majority of voters, but protects the rights of the minorities as well. Americans have been reluctant to grant government too much power. In 1933, the power of the government began to expand in response to the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, and when he ran for president, he didn't give you the impression that he was going to do anything like that. He called for a balanced budget, limited power, and things like this. But once he took office and trying to deal with the Depression, he began to spend a lot more money than had ever been spent and create a lot of new federal agencies, many of which gave people employment. And which is, most people agree today that a job is better than a handout. You meet a person for the first time. The first question is, what is your name? The second question is, what do you do for a living? And if the answer is, I'm unemployed, that can be embarrassing. With the various New Deal agencies, we'll talk about this more later, the pay was woefully inadequate, but it was a start. And it did something for people psychologically to have a job at all. And many of the agencies did put people to use to work doing things they were good at. And the New Deal itself did not bring America out of the Great Depression, but it made it more bearable. What finally brought us out of depression was World War II. But today the national government oversees the nation's economy, is the nation's largest employer, controls the military, regulates social and commercial activities. Over the years, public trust of government has declined. In the early 1960s, 3/4 of Americans said they trusted the government most of the time. By 2017, only less than 1/5 of Americans expressed the same sentiment. Trust hit high levels after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, but fell again. Distrust influenced the presidential elections in 2015 and 2016. It's like a pendulum swinging both directions. At times there's more trust in government, and times there's less trust. But the absence of trust, government cannot function effectively. The public may refuse to pay taxes for needed programs. Government may be unable to attract workers. It may become more difficult to defend national interest. The economy and national security may be put in jeopardy if people do not trust the government. If America goes to war, well, what are we fighting for? And if people don't understand that, we generally in an early stage of a war, there's a lot of public support. And if there's a quick victory, everything's good. People are on board with it. But if it's prolonged, there seems to be no end in sight. There's much less interest in keeping it going. Vietnam became an unpopular war because it seemed like we were not getting anywhere. And by 1975, when the Saigon government fell on April 30th, most Americans decided that saving South Vietnam from the communist takeover just was not worth the money and resources, human life that was involved. And as a result, we lost the war. There's no other way to put it like that. No nice way to say it. But who participates? Well, age is a strong predictor of political participation. Elderly voters in 2016 more likely than younger voters to vote, display a campaign button, lawn sign, or bumper sticker, give money to a candidate, party, or other group, talk about voting for or against a candidate or party, go to political meetings, rallies, or speeches. There's many lobby groups out there, and we have a whole chapter about that, about interest groups, lobbies, sorts. One of the most powerful is the ARP, the American Association of Retired Persons. And one reason they have such political clout is the members vote, and politicians are aware of that. So this is just some of the ideas that are put forth in the first chapter of We the People. We will be presenting a recorded lecture every week and hope that this turns out to be a good semester. Have a great day.